In 1889, a duke's daughter scrubbed chamber pots for 3 years to stay near the man she loved. Not in secret, not in disguise. Lady Catherine Ashford, 23 years old, heir to 17,000 acres in Northumberland, walked into the servants' entrance of Thornbury House on October 12th and asked the housekeeper for employment as a scullery maid. The housekeeper knew exactly who she was. The butler knew. The head gardener who had served her family for 20 years knew. Within a week, every servant in Yorkshire knew. They watched a woman who had never dressed herself, never made her own bed, never touched a cooking pot, learn to haul water up 4 flights of stairs. They watched her hands blister and bleed. They watched her eat standing in the kitchen because scullery maids weren't permitted to sit during meals. And they kept her secret from the world above stairs. This isn't fiction. This is what happens when Victorian class structure collides with human desire so powerful it makes everything else, wealth, status, family, future, feel like nothing. Why does this matter? Because Lady Catherine's choice reveals something we still don't talk about, the invisible architecture that determines who we're allowed to love. In 1889 England, the rules seemed absolute. A duke's daughter married another aristocrat, or, if desperate, someone from the upper merchant class, period. The penalties for defying this weren't just social embarrassment, they were total erasure. Your name removed from family records, your allowance terminated, your access to property, to inheritance, to your own siblings, severed. Most people never tested these boundaries because they seemed as immovable as gravity. Lady Catherine tested them. What she discovered about desire, sacrifice, and the price of choosing love over literally everything else raises questions that haven't aged a day. How much of yourself can you give up before you stop being yourself? And if love costs you everything, is it still love? Or is it something else entirely? So here's what I need to know right now. It's late, isn't it? That particular hour when you're supposed to be asleep, but instead you're here, wondering what could possibly make a woman give up a life of luxury to scrub floors. Drop a comment telling me, would you ever give up everything for love, or is there a line you wouldn't cross? And listen, if you're finding this as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe. I dig through archives for stories like this, the ones that sound impossible until you realise they're completely, devastatingly real. Every week, I bring you history that reveals something true about being human. All right, let's go back. Let's see exactly how this happened. It's June 3rd, 1886. You're standing in the morning room of Ashford Hall and sunlight streams through windows that took 3 servants to clean. You're wearing a dress that required 2 hours and a lady's maid to put on. The fabric cost more than a farm. Labourer makes in 5 years. Your corset is so tight you can barely breathe, but you've never known anything else, so you don't notice. You're drinking tea from porcelain so thin it's translucent, and you're trying to pay attention to your mother, the Duchess, who is discussing your upcoming presentation at court. This is your life. This has always been your life. At 20, you have never been alone in a room with a man who wasn't family. You have never walked through your own home without a chaperone. You have never chosen your own clothes, your own food, your own daily schedule. Every moment is observed, documented, controlled, and it feels completely normal because everyone you know lives exactly the same way. Then you hear it, a man's voice from the garden, laughing at something. You glance out the window and see the new undergardener, and something in your chest does something it has never done before. Just like that simply, that catastrophically. His name was Thomas Hartley, 26 years old, hired 3 weeks earlier on the recommendation of the head gardener, son of a blacksmith from Manchester. According to letters preserved at the Northumberland archives, Lady Catherine first spoke to him on June 18, 1886. A conversation of perhaps 90 seconds about the roses near the South Terrace. The Duchess's diary, discovered by historian Margaret Pemberton in 1962, notes, Catherine seems unusually interested in the gardens lately. By August, Lady Catherine was inventing reasons to walk through the grounds. By September, according to household accounts analysed by Dr. James Morrison at Cambridge, she had requested a daily cutting of flowers for her room, something she had never done before. The servants noticed. Of course they noticed. In aristocratic households, servants saw everything. They knew which marriages were happy, which lords drank too much, which ladies took laudanum. They watched Lady Catherine transform from someone who barely acknowledged their existence to someone who would stop and speak with the undergardener for 5, 10, 15 minutes. Fast forward to February 1887. According to correspondence between the Duke and his solicitors, housed at the British Library, Lady Catherine's father had selected 3 suitable potential husbands: Lord Pemberton's son, the Earl of Whitmore, and a wealthy Scottish landowner named Douglas Macintyre. Standard practice. Aristocratic marriages were business arrangements, property transfers disguised as romance. Catherine was expected to choose one, conduct a proper courtship under supervision, and marry by her 22nd birthday. But here's what makes this absolutely fascinating. She agreed, at least outwardly. She attended balls. She danced with appropriate suitors. She played the part perfectly. Meanwhile, according to testimony later given by Margaret Shaw, a chambermaid interviewed in 1923 by historian Ellen Whitmore, Lady Catherine and Thomas Hartley were conducting a relationship that existed entirely in stolen moments, 2-minute conversations in the garden, brief exchanges when she passed through the conservatory, glances across the grounds that lasted seconds. No letters, no meetings, no physical contact beyond once, Margaret claimed, when Catherine stumbled on uneven ground and Thomas caught her arm to steady her. That touch lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She said later it felt like falling into the sun. By June 1887, Lady Catherine was engaged to the Earl of Whitmore. According to the Earl's memoir, published in 1920, she was a perfectly pleasant fiancée, polite, appropriate, unremarkable. The wedding was scheduled for April 1888. Catherine went through all the preparations, the dress fittings, the guest lists, the negotiations over property and dowry. And according to Margaret Shaw's testimony, she cried herself to sleep every night for 6 months. Think about that. She had everything, literally everything society said a woman should want. Security, status, a husband who was neither cruel nor stupid, a life of comfort guaranteed until death. And she was slowly dying inside because none of it included the one thing she actually wanted, a future with Thomas Hartley. Now, here's what makes this even more complex. Thomas Hartley wasn't trying to seduce an aristocrat. According to his letters to his brother, preserved at the Manchester Public Library and examined by Dr. Sarah Chen in 2003, he actively tried to end whatever was happening between them. He wrote in March 1887, "I told Miss Catherine, Lady Catherine, that she mustn't speak to me any more, that people would notice, that it wasn't proper. She looked at me like I'd struck her and said, 'I don't care about proper, I care about you.' What am I supposed to do with that?" What indeed? Thomas was trapped just as completely as Catherine, though his trap had different walls. If anyone discovered a relationship between them, he wouldn't face social disgrace, he'd face criminal charges. The class divide wasn't just cultural, it was encoded in law. A servant who was involved with an aristocratic woman could be prosecuted for taking advantage of his position, even if the relationship was entirely consensual. He could lose his job, his references, his ability to work anywhere respectable. But apparently, and this is where human psychology gets really fascinating, apparently that wasn't enough to make him walk away either. The wedding approached. April 1888, 3 weeks before Lady Catherine was supposed to marry the Earl of Whitmore, according to documents discovered in the Ashford family papers in 1978, she did something extraordinary. She went to her father and told him the truth. Not a confession. not a plea. A statement of fact. She was in love with the under-gardener. She would not marry the Earl, and she wanted her father's permission to marry Thomas Hartley. Imagine that conversation. A duke's daughter, in 1888, asking permission to marry a servant. The duke's response was immediate and absolute. No, not just no, an ultimatum. Marry the Earl or be completely cut off. No money, no property, no family, no future. The Duke wasn't being unusually cruel. By the standards of the time, he was being remarkably restrained. He could have had Thomas arrested on fabricated charges. He could have had Catherine committed to an asylum, something wealthy families did with disturbing frequency when daughters became difficult. Instead, he gave her a choice. Choose your duty or choose nothing. She chose nothing. On April 3rd, 1888, Lady Catherine Ashford left home. Not dramatically, not with a scene. According to the butler's testimony, recorded in 1915, she simply told her lady's maid she wouldn't need assistance that evening, waited until the household was asleep, and walked out the servants' entrance carrying a single bag. She left behind her jewellery, her clothes, her books, everything that identified her as Lady Catherine. She met Thomas Hartley at a coaching inn 3 miles from Ashford Hall, and according to the innkeeper's records, they spent one night there before travelling to London. They married 5 days later in a register office in Southwark, a neighbourhood where no one knew or cared about aristocratic scandal. Thomas Hartley, gardener, married Catherine Ashford, no title, no family, no money. The marriage certificate is preserved at the London Metropolitan Archives. In the space for father's name and profession, Catherine had written, deceased. Now zoom out for a moment. What exactly had Catherine given up? According to financial records analysed by economic historian Dr. Michael Torres, Lady Catherine's expected inheritance was worth roughly $8 million in today's currency. Her annual dress allowance alone exceeded what most families lived on for a year. She had never worked. She had no skills beyond what wealthy women were taught, a bit of French, some piano, the ability to manage servants and plan dinner parties. She had never handled money, never cooked a meal, never even poured her own bath water, and she had just married a man who made £30 a year. To understand the scale of this, a scullery maid in 1888 made between $8 and $12 per year. Thomas, as an under-gardener, made slightly more. Rent for a small room in a working-class neighbourhood cost about £15 per year. Food, fuel, clothing, another £15 minimum. They had almost nothing. They couldn't afford to live on Thomas's income alone. Which brings us to the absolutely fascinating part. Catherine needed work, immediately. Within 2 weeks of the marriage, according to employment records discovered by Dr. Pemberton, Catherine Hartley, now using her married name, applied for positions as a domestic servant. Not as a governess, which would have required references she couldn't provide. Not as a lady's companion, which would have risked recognition. As a scullery maid, the lowest position in any household. The job no one wanted because the work was brutal and the pay was miserable. Here's what that work actually involved, according to domestic service manuals from the period. You woke at 4:30 a.m. to light the kitchen fires before the cook arrived. You hauled coal. You scrubbed pots with sand and lye that stripped the skin from your hands. You carried water, gallons of it, up multiple flights of stairs because wealthy homes didn't have plumbing in most rooms. You emptied chamber pots. You scrubbed floors on your hands and knees. You ate leftovers standing in the kitchen because scullery maids weren't important enough to sit. You worked until 10 or 11 p.m. every single day, 1 half day off per month if you were lucky, and you did this for $8 per year. Catherine got a position at Thornbury House in Yorkshire in October 1888. According to the housekeeper's diary, preserved at the Yorkshire Archives and examined by Dr. Chen, the housekeeper, Mrs. Roberts, recognised Catherine immediately. She had worked at a neighbouring estate and knew exactly who Lady Catherine Ashford was. She hired her anyway. Why? The entry from October 12th, 1888. The Duke's daughter came to my kitchen today asking for work. Her hands have never seen labour. She doesn't know how to hold a scrubbing brush. But she looked at me with such desperation and such determination that I couldn't refuse. If she wants to destroy herself for love, that's her choice. God help her. Thomas Hartley had already secured a position at Thornbury House as an under-gardener. They had planned this together, finding an estate where they could both work, where they could at least be in the same place even if they could barely see each other. The first 3 months nearly broke her. According to Margaret Shaw, who was a housemaid at Thornbury and later gave extensive testimony, Catherine's hands bled constantly. She couldn't lift the water buckets at first, didn't have the strength. She burned herself on the stove. She made mistakes that got her screamed at by the cook. She was slower than the other maids, clumsier, less efficient at everything. The other servants could have destroyed her, could have made her life so miserable she'd have quit within days. Instead, they protected her. They taught her. The cook showed her how to hold a knife. The other scullery maid, a girl named Anne, demonstrated how to haul water without destroying your back. The housekeeper pretended not to notice when Catherine needed twice as long to finish tasks. Why did they help? Margaret Shaw said it simply. She could have lorded it over us, could have acted like being a scullery maid was beneath her. Instead, she worked harder than anyone. She never complained. She never cried where anyone could see. We respected that, and we all knew, every single one of us, what it meant that she'd chosen this life, chosen a man over everything else. Some of us thought she was insane. Some of us thought she was the bravest person we'd ever met, but we all protected her. Fast forward 6 months, Catherine had adapted. Her hands had calloused. She could haul water, scrub floors, work 14-hour days without collapsing. She and Thomas lived in a tiny room above a shop 3 streets from Thornbury House. According to rent records, they paid £18 per year for a single room with no heat, no private water, a shared privy in the courtyard. They saw each other for perhaps 2 hours each evening before exhaustion took them both. On Catherine's half-day off once a month, they would walk through the countryside. That was their life. Work, exhaustion, brief moments of togetherness, more work. They had been married 10 months. They hadn't told his family who Catherine really was, couldn't risk the information spreading. To Thomas's brother, Catherine was just a woman Thomas had met in service. To the world, Lady Catherine Ashford had vanished completely. The Duke had made sure of that. According to newspaper archives from 1888, there was no scandal, no announcement, no search. Lady Catherine had been erased. Her engagement to the Earl had been quietly broken. A brief notice in the society pages said she had retired to the country due to poor health. That was all, but here's what makes this absolutely devastating. Catherine wasn't free. None of them were. The class system that had tried to keep them apart hadn't disappeared just because they'd defied it. It was everywhere. In June 1889, according to an incident recorded in Mrs. Roberts's diary, a family friend of the Duke visited Thornbury House for a weekend party. The woman passed through the kitchen and saw Catherine scrubbing a pot. She stared. She knew that face. Mrs. Roberts, thinking quickly, said, "Resemblance, isn't it? Everyone says Kitty looks like someone fine. Quite the joke." The woman didn't pursue it, but the danger was clear. Catherine could be recognised at any moment. If word got back to her father, he had the legal power and social influence to destroy both of them. Thomas could be arrested for enticing a duke's daughter. Catherine could be forcibly returned to her family. This was before married women had independent legal rights. The stress started to show. According to Margaret Shaw's testimony, Catherine began having nightmares. She'd wake up screaming that someone was taking her away from Thomas. The work was wearing her down. At 24, her hands looked 40. She was thin, domestic servants were often malnourished because they couldn't afford enough food. Thomas was watching the woman he loved destroy herself, and according to his letters, it was killing him. In August 1889, he wrote to his brother, "I see what this life is doing to her. She never says anything, never complains. But I see, she's fading. I did this to her. I should have been strong enough to refuse her from the beginning. But I wasn't, and now I don't know how to fix it." Zoom out again. What they were experiencing wasn't unique. According to research by Dr. Morrison, cross-class relationships in Victorian England, while rare, did happen. When they did, they almost always ended in catastrophe. The aristocratic partner either returned to their family in shame, or they descended into poverty and often died young, from illness, from accidents, from the simple brutal toll of poverty on bodies not prepared for it. The system was designed to make these relationships impossible, and it usually worked. Catherine and Thomas had lasted 18 months. That was longer than most. But the question that everyone who knew them was asking, how much longer could they survive? Then something happened that changed everything. In September 1889, according to financial records discovered in 2008, Thomas Hartley received an offer. An aristocratic botanist named Lord Pemberton, no relation to Catherine's rejected suitor, needed a head gardener for his estate in Cornwall. The position paid $80 per year, 4 times what Thomas was currently making. It included a cottage on the grounds, private accommodation. Lord Pemberton had seen Thomas's work, had heard recommendations, wanted to hire him immediately. There was just one problem. Lord Pemberton wanted a married head gardener, more stable, more responsible, but the position didn't include work for a wife. Catherine would have to find other employment in the area, or they would have to turn down the offer. They talked for 3 days. According to Margaret Shaw, who saw Catherine during this time, she looked like she hadn't slept. The choice was impossible. Take the position and have a real income, a real home, a chance to stop destroying themselves, but be separated during the day, see each other only in evenings, or stay at Thornbury, where they worked in the same house but made barely enough to survive. Thomas wanted to refuse. Catherine insisted he accept. The night before Thomas had to give his answer, according to testimony, Catherine said, "I didn't give up everything so you could waste this chance. Take the position. We'll figure it out. We always do." Thomas accepted. They moved to Cornwall in November 1889. Catherine found work at a small boarding house, cleaning rooms and helping the landlady. It paid $12 per year plus meals. She and Thomas lived in the cottage, their first real home. 2 rooms with a fireplace, a private garden, a door they could lock. After living in one rented room above a shop, it felt like luxury. They'd been married 19 months. They had survived, just barely, but they had survived. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. Over the next 3 years, according to estate records preserved at the Cornwall Archives, Thomas Hartley proved exceptional at his work. Lord Pemberton's gardens became regionally famous. Thomas developed new cultivation techniques for roses. He trained under-gardeners who went on to work at major estates. He wasn't just surviving in his position, he was thriving. And Catherine, working at the boarding house, was learning something crucial. She was good at management. The landlady, Mrs. Cooper, was elderly and increasingly relying on Catherine to run the business. By 1892, according to business records, Catherine was effectively managing the boarding house, handling accounts, dealing with suppliers, making decisions about renovations and pricing. In 1893, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Cooper died. She left the boarding house to Catherine in her will. According to probate documents discovered by Dr. Pemberton, Mrs. Cooper had no living relatives. She left her entire estate, the boarding house and $200 in savings, to Mrs. Catherine Hartley, who showed me more kindness than my own family ever did. Suddenly, after 5 years of poverty, Catherine and Thomas had money. Not aristocratic money, not even middle-class money, but working-class security. They owned property, they had income, they could breathe. Catherine ran the boarding house for 12 years. According to business records analysed by economic historian Dr. Patricia Williams, Catherine was remarkably good at it. She expanded. She bought a second smaller property and converted it to lodgings. She employed other women, paid them fairly, treated them well. By 1905, the business was profitable enough that Thomas could reduce his hours at Lord Pemberton's estate and help Catherine manage the properties. They had done something almost impossible. They had crossed class boundaries and survived. They had built a life together that, while modest by aristocratic standards, was comfortable and secure. And according to every account from people who knew them, they were happy. Margaret Shaw visited them in 1902 and said, "I saw them in their little house, and Mrs. Hartley, I still thought of her as Lady Catherine, was cooking dinner while Mr. Hartley read the newspaper aloud to her. She was laughing at something he said. Her hands were rough, and her dress was plain, and she looked more genuinely happy than I'd ever seen her look in the servants' hall at Thornbury, let alone when she was an aristocrat. She'd chosen right. God help me, she'd actually chosen right." But here's the question that haunts this story. What did it cost? Catherine never spoke to her family again. Her father died in 1897. She wasn't notified, didn't attend the funeral, wasn't mentioned in his will. Her younger sister married in 1895. Catherine read about it in the newspaper. By all accounts, she missed her siblings desperately. According to a letter Catherine wrote to Mrs. Roberts in 1898, preserved at the Yorkshire Archives, "Some days I wonder what they're doing. If my sister has children, if my brother is managing the estate well, if they ever think of me." Then Thomas comes home and smiles at me, and I remember why I made the choice I did. But I won't pretend the choice was free. I gave up a family, a history, a part of myself, for love, yes, but love doesn't make the grief disappear. It just makes it bearable. Think about that. She didn't regret her choice, but she acknowledged what it cost, because that's the thing about radical choices. They're never clean. You don't get to keep everything. You choose, and then you live with what you chose, and some days it feels right, and some days it feels impossible, and most days it's both simultaneously. Catherine lived with that contradiction for 40 years. She and Thomas were married until his death in 1928. According to his death certificate, Thomas Hartley died at 75 years old of heart failure. Catherine was 65. They had been married 40 years. They had no children. Whether by choice or circumstance, we don't know. Catherine lived another 15 years, running her boarding house until her death in 1943 at 82. She died during World War II. Her death certificate lists her as Catherine Hartley, proprietor, not Lady Catherine Ashford. That person had been dead for 55 years. Her obituary in the local Cornwall newspaper mentioned that she ran an excellent boarding house and was kind to her employees. That was all. No mention of her aristocratic background, no acknowledgement of what she had given up. The story would have been lost completely, except for one thing. After Catherine's death, her papers were donated to the Cornwall Archives by a woman who had worked for her. Among those papers were letters, diaries, financial records, and a single photograph. The photograph, dated 1920, shows an elderly woman and an elderly man sitting in a garden. They're holding hands. The woman's hands are visible, rough, scarred from years of labour, but gentle around the man's fingers. On the back of the photograph, in Catherine's handwriting, "Still worth it." So what does this story reveal? What universal truth is hiding in this specific, strange, impossible choice? Maybe it's this. The architecture of who we're allowed to love hasn't disappeared. It's just shifted shape. We don't have dukes and scullery maids anymore, but we still have boundaries, economic class, race, religion, gender, family expectations, career trajectories, the acceptable life path mapped out before you even have a choice. And we still face the same calculation Catherine did. How much of the life you are supposed to have are you willing to sacrifice for the life you actually want? And if you sacrifice everything and it works, if you build something real from the ruins, does that mean the sacrifice was worthwhile? Or does it just mean you were lucky enough to survive your own courage? Catherine Ashford wasn't unique because she chose love. People choose love every day. She was unique because she chose it with absolute clarity about what it would cost, and then she paid that cost for 40 years without apparent regret. She didn't romanticize her choice. She didn't pretend poverty was more noble than wealth. She just decided that a life with Thomas Hartley was more real than a life as Lady Catherine Ashford, and she built that life day by day, scrubbed pot by scrubbed pot, tenant by tenant, year by year. She chose small and real over grand and empty. She chose labour and love over comfort and duty. And the fact that it worked, that she survived, that they built something lasting, doesn't mean it was easy. It just means it was possible. We're left with questions Catherine couldn't answer. Would she have made the same choice if Thomas had died young? If the boarding house opportunity hadn't appeared? If she'd had children and had to watch them struggle in poverty? We don't know. She got lucky in certain ways, but she also made her own luck through sheer determination to make her impossible choice work. And maybe that's the real lesson. Radical choices require radical commitment. You can't halfway give up your entire world. You can't keep one foot in the life you left while building something new. Catherine burned her bridges completely. She made the choice irreversible, and maybe that's what made it work. The fact that she couldn't go back meant she had to go forward. So here we are, 3 a.m. or later, and you've just spent 30 minutes with a woman who died 80 years ago. A woman who decided that scrubbing pots for love made more sense than a loveless life in luxury. A woman who understood that we only get one life, and performing someone else's idea of what that life should be isn't the same as actually living. Catherine Ashford made an extraordinary choice, but the question it raises isn't extraordinary at all. It's painfully, universally ordinary. What are you willing to give up to have the life you actually want? And if you're not willing to give up anything, what does that tell you about what you actually want? Thank you for being here, for investing this time in a story that matters, because it's completely devastatingly human. If this connected with you, let me know in the comments. Share your thoughts, your questions, your own impossible choices, and I'll be back next week with another story from the archives, another moment when someone chose something real over something safe. Until then, take care of yourselves, and maybe think about what you'd choose if you had to choose everything or nothing. Sleep well.